Arrest him. He doesn't belong here. Those words sliced through the quiet suburban evening like a siren, and for my 15-year-old son, they weren't just noise, they were a nightmare. He had been walking home from basketball practice, his sneakers scuffing the sidewalk, his gym bag slung over one shoulder, his mind drifting between the game he'd just played and the sandwich he planned to make when he got home. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. Just a kid making his way back to the house he'd lived in for years. But suddenly, out of nowhere, two men appeared. They weren't cops, though they certainly looked the part. Dark uniforms, fake badges glinting in the fading sunlight, radios crackling as if they were coordinating some grand operation. My son didn't know what to do. He froze, his eyes wide, his body trembling as one of the men stepped directly into his path. "You don't live here," the man barked, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Show us your ID." My son stammered, I live right down there. 3 houses away." He pointed down the street, his voice cracking with both fear and confusion. But the man wasn't listening. Instead, he gave a quick nod to his partner, who immediately grabbed my son's arm and twisted it behind his back, ignoring the boy's cries of pain. My son's backpack slipped off his shoulder, hitting the ground with a dull thud, the zipper breaking open and spilling his basketball and homework across the pavement. "Suspicious person on foot," one of them said into the radio, even though it wasn't connected to anything real. It was all for show, a performance, a cheap imitation of real authority. The neighbors peeked through their blinds, watching the scene unfold but saying nothing. To them, it looked official enough. After all, the HOA had been bragging for weeks about their new security initiative. Nobody realized these men were nothing more than board members playing dress-up. My son tried again, his voice trembling, "Please, I live here. My parents." "Quiet," the man snapped, shoving him toward the curb. "We've had reports of break-ins. You fit the description." It didn't matter that he was in basketball shorts, sneakers, and still sweaty from practice. It didn't matter that he pointed directly to his house. These men weren't after justice. They were after control. And they thought they'd found an easy target in a scared teenager. One of them pulled open the back door of a black SUV parked nearby. The windows were tinted, the side had a cheap decal that vaguely resembled a police emblem, and inside it smelled like vinyl and intimidation. They shoved my son in, ignoring his pleas. He tried to call me from his phone, but they snatched it away, saying, "Tell it to the judge." In that moment, my son thought his life was over. He told me later that his heart was pounding so hard he could barely breathe, that he wondered if he'd ever see home again. He was trapped in a car with strangers dressed like police, his freedom stolen by people who had no legal right to touch him. And here's the part that makes my blood run cold: nobody stepped in. Not one neighbor came out to ask what was happening. They all just assumed it was legitimate. That's the power of a fake badge. It silences doubt. It makes people second-guess their instincts. But my son wasn't entirely powerless. With his free hand, he managed to grab the broken zipper of his backpack, yank it upward, and fish out the small phone charger I'd given him earlier that day. Using the cord, he pressed the emergency button on his smartwatch, which buzzed silently against his wrist. And that's how I got the call. "Dad," his voice was trembling, broken, barely more than a whisper. "They've got me. They say I don't live here. Please come." I remember the way my blood went ice cold. I was sitting at the kitchen table, half reading emails when the buzz came through, and I heard those words. My chair scraped against the floor as I shot up, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. My son had never sounded so scared. I didn't even stop to put on shoes, I just ran. By the time I turned the corner onto our street, I saw the black SUV, the two men standing tall with smug expressions, and my son's pale, terrified face peering out from the back seat. His hands were pressed against the glass, his lips forming the words, help me. I sprinted forward, shouting, "Get away from him. That's my son." One of the men held up a hand like a traffic cop, smirking as if this was all just routine. "Step back, sir. This is official business." "Official business?" I barked. "You're not cops. Let him out now." The taller man reached into his pocket, pulled out a shiny badge, and flashed it in my face. "We're authorized by the HOA. We have every right to detain suspicious individuals." My fists clenched at my sides. My brain screamed at me to rip that door open and drag my son out, but something told me to hold back, to not give them the satisfaction of escalating. Because I knew one thing they didn't, I had backup. "You have 10 seconds to let him out," I growled. The man chuckled. "Or what? You'll call the police? We are the police here." That was the last straw. I yanked my phone from my pocket, scrolled to speed dial, and hit the one number I knew would flip this entire situation on its head. My wife answered on the first ring. "What's wrong?" she asked, instantly sensing the panic in my voice. "They've got him," I said through gritted teeth. "The HOA. Fake cops. They shoved him into a car." Silence. Then, her voice, sharp as a blade, "Stay there. I'm coming." And that was the moment those imposters made the biggest mistake of their lives. Because they didn't just detain a kid. They didn't just impersonate an officer. They kidnapped the son of the district attorney. By the time I sprinted down the street, my lungs burning and my heart pounding, I could see my son's face through the tinted SUV window. His cheeks were streaked with tears, his lips trembling as he tried to mouth words to me. He looked so small, so helpless in the back of that vehicle, like a trapped bird with nowhere to fly. My anger boiled over, hotter than anything I'd ever felt in my life. These men had crossed a line they could never uncross. I rushed forward, shouting at the top of my lungs, "Let him out right now. That's my boy, and you're kidnapping him." The taller man, who looked like he enjoyed the sound of his own authority a little too much, stepped forward, puffing out his chest like he was some kind of real officer. "Sir, I suggest you calm down," he sneered, holding up that fake badge again like it was made of gold. "Your son doesn't belong here. We've had reports of suspicious individuals wandering the neighborhood. We're authorized to investigate and detain." "Authorized by who?" I snapped. "The police? The sheriff? Or just your little clubhouse of wannabe tough guys?" The shorter man snorted, clearly enjoying the power trip. "We're the neighborhood watch. We've got full permission from the HOA to handle situations like this. If you don't step back, we'll have no choice but to arrest you too." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These men had taken my child, stuffed him into a car like a criminal, and now they were threatening to arrest me on the sidewalk in front of my own house. My fists itched to knock both of them flat, but I forced myself to think clearly. I knew one wrong move could give them an excuse to hurt my son. "Listen carefully," I said, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. "That boy lives here. He is my son. You let him out of that car right now, or I swear you'll regret this for the rest of your lives." The taller man smirked, leaning closer until I could smell the coffee on his breath. "Big words, but you don't scare us. The HOA gives us full authority. This is our jurisdiction." I barked out a laugh, not because anything was funny, but because the absurdity was almost too much to bear. "Jurisdiction? You think the HOA has jurisdiction to impersonate law enforcement and kidnap minors? You've just bought yourself a one-way ticket to prison." They didn't flinch. If anything, the smugness on their faces deepened, as if they believed they were untouchable, as if the neighborhood was their little kingdom. That's when I decided to play my trump card. Without breaking eye contact, I pulled out my phone, scrolled to the number on speed dial, and pressed it. My wife answered instantly, her voice calm but sharp, like a blade drawn in the dark. What happened? They've got him, I said quickly, glancing toward the SUV where my son sat trembling. The HOA thugs. Fake cops. They shoved him into a car, said he doesn't belong here. There was a pause, then her voice came back, steel wrapped in fire. Stay put. I'm on my way. I didn't need to say more. She understood. Because my wife wasn't just any parent. She wasn't just another neighbor powerless against the HOA's games. She was the district attorney of this county, the woman whose signature could end careers, whose voice carried the weight of the law itself. And these fools had no idea they had just picked a fight with her. I slid my phone back into my pocket and looked the men dead in the eye. You two are about to meet someone who actually has authority. The taller one tilted his head, trying to sound unfazed. Oh yeah? Who's that? You'll see, I muttered. It didn't take long. Within minutes, the sound of screeching tires echoed down the street. A sleek black sedan swung into the cul-de-sac, stopping so abruptly the tires left faint marks on the pavement. The door flew open, and out stepped my wife, heels clicking on the asphalt, her professional suit sharp enough to cut glass. In her hand, she carried her briefcase. On her hip, her official badge gleamed in the sunlight like a warning flare. The two men stiffened, their smug grins faltering for the first time. One of them muttered, "Oh, who's this?" I couldn't help but smile grimly. "This," I said, stepping aside so they had a full view, "is the district attorney. And she's not in the mood for games." She strode right up to the SUV without so much as a glance at the imposters, her focus locked on our son. She tapped on the window, her knuckles sharp and commanding. "Open it," she said firmly. The shorter man shifted nervously. Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a neighborhood matter. We're authorized. Open the door." Her voice cut through him like a knife. Now. The taller man swallowed hard, trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. "Ma'am, we're just trying to keep the community safe. We thought he was a stranger. He didn't look like." My wife turned slowly, her eyes narrowing into a glare so fierce it could have frozen fire. Then, with deliberate calm, she pulled her real badge from her jacket pocket and held it up just inches from his face. "I am the district attorney of this county. You have unlawfully detained a minor. You have impersonated law enforcement. And you are seconds away from being in handcuffs yourselves. Now. Open that door." The silence was suffocating. For the first time since this nightmare began, the men looked uncertain. Their fake confidence was crumbling. Finally, with trembling hands, the taller one unlocked the SUV. The door creaked open, and my son stumbled out, his eyes wide, his breathing ragged. He ran straight into his mother's arms, burying his face against her shoulder as she wrapped him tightly in her embrace. "You're safe now," she whispered, stroking his hair. "Nobody will ever hurt you like that again." I felt my knees weaken with relief. The sight of him free, clinging to his mother, was almost too much for me to take. But my wife wasn't done. She turned back to the men, her posture straight, her voice cold as stone. "You two are finished. You don't move, you don't speak, you don't even breathe until real law enforcement gets here. Do you understand?" They nodded quickly, the smugness wiped clean from their faces, replaced with the stark realization of just how badly they had messed up. The taller one stammered, "Ma'am, we were just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. We thought he was a stranger, that's all." His voice cracked with every word, the arrogance from earlier slipping away like sand through fingers. The shorter one stayed silent, shifting nervously, his eyes darting between my wife's badge and the growing crowd of neighbors who had come outside to watch. People had gathered on porches, some with their arms folded, some whispering, some recording with their phones. Everyone knew something big was unfolding. My wife didn't flinch. She stepped closer to the men, her eyes locked on theirs. You kidnapped a minor. You impersonated a police officer. And you dared to put your hands on my son. Do you have any idea the kind of prison time you're looking at? Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried the kind of weight that could crush steel. The taller man's face went pale. Ma'am, please, you don't understand. The HOA authorized us. We didn't mean any harm. We're just volunteers. Volunteers, she shot back. Volunteers don't wear fake badges. Volunteers don't shove kids into vehicles and strip them of their phones. Volunteers don't lie to parents and pretend to be cops. No, what you are is criminals. And lucky for you, I brought company. Right on cue, the distant wail of sirens cut through the neighborhood. Red and blue lights reflected off every window, growing brighter with each passing second. Within moments, 2 marked police cruisers screeched to a halt, followed by a sheriff's SUV. The imposters froze, caught in a trap of their own making. The officers stepped out, their real uniforms crisp, their real badges shining under the streetlights. One of them approached, his hand resting near his holster. District Attorney, he said respectfully, nodding at my wife. We got your call. What's the situation? She turned slightly, pointing directly at the 2 men. These individuals unlawfully detained my son, impersonated law enforcement, and attempted to pass themselves off as officers of the law. They need to be placed under arrest immediately. The taller man stumbled backward, his fake badge slipping from his fingers and clattering to the pavement. Wait, this is all a misunderstanding. We were just doing our jobs. We were told by the HOA president to keep watch over the neighborhood. We thought he was trespassing. The officer's expression hardened. And who told you impersonating a police officer was part of your job? The shorter man tried to interject, his words tumbling over each other. It wasn't like that. We didn't mean to hurt him. We were just following orders. The officer cut him off sharply. You put your hands on a child. You shoved him into a vehicle against his will. That's kidnapping. You wore fake badges and claimed authority you didn't have. That's impersonation of a peace officer. You're both under arrest. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was music to my ears. The men, once so smug and powerful, now stood humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood, their hands bound behind their backs, their heads hanging low. But the chaos wasn't over yet. From across the street, a voice boomed, dripping with anger and desperation. This is outrageous. You can't arrest them. They were doing their duty. Every head turned. Marching toward the scene was none other than the HOA president himself, a red-faced man in his 50s with a permanent scowl etched across his face. He stormed past the crowd, his finger jabbing the air like a weapon. I gave them authorization. They're part of our community security team. You can't just drag them off like criminals. My wife's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward to meet him. Authorization, she repeated slowly. You authorized them to impersonate law enforcement officers? To kidnap minors off the street? To shove a child into a car and terrify him half to death? The president puffed up his chest, his voice dripping with indignation. It's our right as an HOA to protect this neighborhood. Crime rates are rising. We have to keep an eye out for strangers, and if that means detaining a few people who don't look like they belong, then so be it. That boy didn't look like he lived here. The crowd gasped audibly. My son clung tighter to his mother's arm, and I felt my blood run cold. Not only had this man condoned what happened, he was justifying it. He didn't care that my son lived here. He didn't care that they had traumatized a child. He only cared about his illusion of power. My wife's voice cut through the tension like thunder. Do you hear yourself? You think you're above the law because you sit on a neighborhood board? Let me make something crystal clear, HOA rules are not the law. They do not supersede state law. They do not allow you to impersonate officers, and they sure as hell do not allow you to terrorize children. The president's face turned purple with rage. This is harassment. I'll have your badge for this. You don't know who you're messing with. At that, my wife let out a small, cold laugh. On the contrary. It's you who doesn't know who you're messing with. You messed with my family. You messed with the district attorney. And now, you've messed with the law. The sheriff stepped forward, his voice booming. Mr. President, I suggest you watch your words carefully. From what I'm hearing, you ordered these men to impersonate law enforcement. That makes you complicit. You may want to call a lawyer, because after tonight, you'll be needing one. The president's jaw dropped, his bluster crumbling as the weight of the situation finally sank in. Neighbors who once feared him now whispered openly, some shaking their heads, others smirking as his grip on power slipped away in real time. The police escorted the two fake officers to their cruisers, their heads bowed, their wrists bound. The president stood frozen, his face ashen, his empire of control collapsing in front of the very people he had lorded over for years. My wife wrapped her arm protectively around our son and turned to the sheriff. File every charge you can. Kidnapping. Impersonating an officer. False imprisonment. Endangerment of a minor. And make sure this HOA knows, the law doesn't bend to their rules. The sheriff nodded solemnly. Understood, ma'am. And just like that, the power dynamic of the entire neighborhood shifted. No longer was the HOA feared. No longer were their fake rules seen as unshakable. The spell had been broken. The very next morning, the story had already exploded beyond our neighborhood. Reporters camped at the entrance to the subdivision, cameras flashing as police cars drove in and out. Helicopters circled overhead. By noon, every local station carried the same headline, Fake HOA Cops Arrest Teen, District Attorney's Son Targeted. The story spread like wildfire, shared on social media thousands of times within hours. Comment sections were on fire with outrage. Parents across the county were furious. Everyone was asking the same question, how could an HOA get away with something like this? The two men who had impersonated officers were booked into county jail overnight, facing multiple felony charges, impersonation of a peace officer, unlawful restraint, false imprisonment, child endangerment, and attempted kidnapping. Their mugshots were plastered all over the evening news, their smug confidence from the night before replaced with hollow, defeated stares. But the fallout didn't stop there. The HOA president tried to go on the defensive, releasing a statement calling the whole thing a misunderstanding. He claimed the men were simply overzealous volunteers who took their duties too far, and that the HOA had never intended to harm anyone. He even had the audacity to say, "We were just keeping our community safe. Sometimes mistakes happen." My wife nearly laughed when she read it. Mistakes? That wasn't a mistake. That was a crime, she said, tossing the statement aside. And now, they're going to pay for it. Within 48 hours, the DA's office, my wife's office, had officially filed charges. Not only against the two imposters but also against the HOA president himself. Emails and text messages had been recovered, showing that he had personally approved their so-called security patrol and encouraged them to use whatever authority was necessary to keep the neighborhood free of outsiders. That single line buried him. It proved this wasn't just two men on a power trip, it was an organized scheme led by the HOA itself. The trial became one of the most talked about cases in the county. Every hearing was packed with reporters, neighbors, and parents who wanted to see justice served. The prosecutor assigned to the case stood in the courtroom and laid everything bare, the fake uniforms, the counterfeit badges, the tinted SUV with knockoff decals, the terrifying ordeal my son went through. And then, of course, the jury heard directly from my boy. He sat there, small and nervous, his voice trembling as he recounted how they grabbed him, twisted his arm, shoved him into the car, and took his phone. At one point, he choked up, and my wife squeezed his hand from the front row, silently reassuring him he was safe. By the time he finished, half the jury looked ready to leap from their seats and drag the defendant straight to prison. The defense tried every trick in the book. They said it was all a community misunderstanding. They said the men had no intent to harm. They even tried to paint my son as uncooperative, suggesting he could have avoided the ordeal if he had just obeyed their orders. That argument backfired instantly. The jury saw through it. They saw what everyone else did, two grown men abusing fake power to terrify a kid. After only 3 hours of deliberation, the verdict came back, guilty on all counts. The judge didn't hold back, either. He sentenced both men to years in prison, making it clear that impersonating law enforcement and traumatizing children would never be tolerated in his courtroom. The HOA president wasn't spared, either. While his charges were less severe, he faced heavy fines, probation, and a civil lawsuit that would haunt him for years. His reputation was destroyed, his position as president stripped, and his neighbors, who once feared him, voted him out unanimously. But the punishment didn't stop with criminal charges. My wife spearheaded a civil case against the HOA itself, representing not just our family but several others who had been harassed in the past. Residents came forward with stories of intimidation, bogus fines, threats, and even unlawful property inspections carried out by these same board members. It turned out my son wasn't the first victim, he was just the one who finally exposed them. The lawsuit dragged on for months, but in the end, the HOA lost spectacularly. They were ordered to pay damages to multiple families, their budget gutted by legal fees and settlements. The association was forced to dissolve entirely, replaced by a new voluntary neighborhood council run by residents who actually cared about the community instead of playing cop. For the first time in years, people felt free to live without harassment. No more fake citations, no more bullying letters, no more threats. Just neighbors living peacefully. The media coverage was relentless. National outlets picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about unchecked HOA power. Commentators debated it on talk shows. Parents everywhere shook their heads in disbelief, saying, "That could have been my kid." My wife became something of a local hero, not just as the DA but as a mother who stood up for her son and held the powerful accountable. As for our family, it took time for the wounds to heal. My son struggled with nightmares for weeks afterward. He would wake up in a sweat, convinced he was back in that SUV, powerless against strangers with fake authority. We got him counseling, surrounded him with support, and reminded him every day that he was safe. Slowly, the fear faded. Slowly, the strength returned. And through it all, he learned something invaluable, that sometimes people in positions of power aren't what they seem. That sometimes, the ones shouting the loudest about rules and authority are the ones breaking the law the most. But he also learned that he had parents who would never stop fighting for him, no matter the odds. One evening, months later, as we walked down the same sidewalk where it all began, my son stopped and looked up at me. "Dad," he said quietly, "I thought they were going to take me away forever. But then Mom showed up. I've never felt safer in my life than when she opened that door." I smiled, ruffling his hair. "That's because your mom doesn't just fight cases in court. She fights for her family. And no fake badge in the world can stand against that." He nodded, his eyes brighter now, his shoulders a little straighter. That night marked the end of his fear and the start of something new, a belief that no matter how dark things seemed, justice always finds a way through. And as for the two men who thought they could bully a teenager, they now wake up every morning behind steel bars, far away from the neighborhood they once pretended to protect. The HOA president who thought he was untouchable? He spends his days signing legal settlements and watching everything he built crumble. In the end, the ones who thought they had all the power lost everything, while my son, once their victim, walked free, his head held high, knowing that his family and the law stood firmly behind him. That's the thing about power built on lies. It always collapses. And the look on their faces, when they realized the boy they tried to arrest had a district attorney for a mom, that's something I'll never forget.